So really like kind of our core organizing pillars are, policy, mobilization, engagement, and education. So how can we, through this policy focus, bring more young people to the table in a way that leads to, broader social change? And we do this through a lot of different ways, whether it's various forms of direct action. So everything from writing and informing policies to providing peer advocacy and support, creating various mechanisms for youth representation, and then also doing a lot of kind of community outreach through various partner organizations, and really trying to learn from peers from all over the country about what are the issues that are affecting them, and how can youth written and youth advocated policy really make a difference in the lives of others. And lastly, like, we really try to serve as like a kind of policy incubator for young people. So we'll often like bring people who need support and have an incredible idea and want to see it turn into policy, and work with them to try to develop the skills and resources for that. Pass it over to Lailah.
Yeah. Sorry, my mic wasn't unmuting. So we have a strategy of how to get young people involved and connected, not only with the legislative writing process, but also the coalition building process, which can seem a little scary and daunting initially when getting into the civic engagement space. But it is totally accessible to anybody at any level that they are, especially if you have an issue that you care about very directly, whether it's personal to you or personal to your community. It is definitely possible. And we hope to kind of break down some of those maybe initial barriers of understanding so that you can find ways to integrate these strategies into your own communities. So, firstly, there's drafting and informing legislation in Congress and state legislatures. We have worked on a numerous amount of bills that are hopefully intending to work with the youth and get the youth involved not only with the legislative writing process, but also connect politicians and local officials to the youth community. I think sometimes we understand that there is that disconnect between elected officials and youth activists, and some of the best ways to bridge that gap is working on legislation together and providing that shared and mutual understanding and impact. Secondarily, is identifying urgent youth needs to inform bipartisan priorities and response. So, whether that's local forums, having public spaces where people can share their perspectives and opinions, open mics, literally anything is possible. But when you provide these spaces for people to share their perspectives and opinions, you can have a more holistic understanding overall of what you're trying to tackle and how to tackle it. And then, kind of what I was mentioning earlier, uniting diverse stakeholders and leveraging intergenerational partnerships through coalitions goes further than just the elected officials route. You can also partner with organizations within your community or within your state or nationally, that can help you get plugged into some of the more institutional interworkings of some of the issues that you really care about and matter to you, so that the barriers that you might have to cross or thresholds that you might have to understand in order to get certain types of legislation done. And then lastly, informing the public narrative by amplifying lived experiences through op-ed features and media engagement is a great way not only to connect your community work and the work that you've done in order to project some of your own personal values on the legislation that you're working on, but also inform other people. We all start at one place when we're getting involved in the policy or advocacy space. And sometimes it's hard to really realize how capable young people are until you see other young people doing it. And so I think a great way of getting more people mobilized in causes that you care about are sharing those causes and being open and strong advocates about what you believe in.
So, with that in mind, we're really going to dive in to this idea of, how do we extend youth civic engagement beyond an election? So, I'm sure, like, obviously, a lot of you here are AGF ambassadors or are in some way involved in this network, and know that, like, a lot of this incredible work is being done to engage, young people, particularly college students, in registering to vote and getting their peers to turn out to vote. But the way we look at it is, if our only focus is, you know, the election in November, then we're never going to really truly build that momentum in the same way as like looking back at the Freedom Summer, that like getting people engaged beyond this is so incredibly important. So we're here to share some tips and experiences and guidance on how to take the momentum that exists within your communities, either on campus or wherever home is for you, and turn that into like meaningful change through policy and organizing. So I think like the most important kind of like initial step in our work is always identifying needs. So whether it's something related to civic engagement, to the health and wellness of your community, whether it's related to policing or to incarceration, whatever it may be, that it's really easy to see like the ways that there are intersections in our lives and throughout our communities. So, many of the stories that we, kind of even just tell each other on a daily basis, often like have real needs that government could and should be addressing. And that's where it is so important to, have those spaces where we can all come together and share. Because there's something really powerful about, a group of people coming together and realizing that like there's a shared concern and there's a way that we can come together to really push and fight for a better future for us and our peers. So really, these issues, Youth Power Project is a nonpartisan organization. All of the work we do is done through solely bipartisan policy. So really, the approach we always try to tell people is that there's always a way to connect your lived experiences with those of others and turn that into something that can actually like change an actual policy. So some of like the like key questions that we often ask ourselves when we're trying to come up with new policy ideas, and when we're working with other young people, is kind of like looking at after you identify these needs, whatever issue area is most important to you, and some of the factors that may play into it, to really think through like who has the power to mitigate these issues, because a lot of our work is in mental health advocacy. And with that, like, we often look at, kind of mental health kind of fields where, is the education system, the place to make the change. So do you focus in on, specifically like teachers and staff, practitioners, school districts, university administration, but then also a lot of, stuff in the mental health space, but also and a lot of the education space at large also comes down to state and federal policy. So really looking at like which people in power have the ability to influence and affect that issue that you care about, and not every problem has a policy solution, but really being able to point out like who are the key people that you need to talk to in order to really be able to enact that change is really important. Um, and then once you're able to identify like which level of, power would be the best place to take your issue, I think like really trying to see like, what existing policies exist and how could they potentially be modified. So that works, state, local, federal, but also at a university level, that it's really easy to see that, certain policies, whether they were made, a year ago or 20 years ago, don't always reflect the realities of the lived experiences of people that are at the direct result of those policies. So really being able to take a solid look and see like whether it is working with the people who initially created that policy, or using that language of an existing policy as a basis to change and recreate what that could look like. There's just a ton of really cool opportunities that come from like really taking this like personal narrative and your lived experiences and things you're passionate about, and identifying the ways that you can use your voice and power to really make a difference, not just for yourself but for others as well. So I wanted to do a brief little like chat engagement. Obviously, I know a lot of you are here because of your passion for voting and voting rights, but would love to like kind of just like there's a bunch of questions on screen, but like, what kind of like brings you into this space in caring about our democracy and wanting to, see it become a better place. But then also like really like how have your like community experiences, whether that's community on campus or back at home, really like influenced your participation within kind of the voting sphere. So anyone wants to answer in the chat or come off mute, you're definitely welcome.
Um, Hi, my name is Giancarlo.
Hi.
I'm from Miami, Florida, and I'm just graduated from high school, so I'm an incoming student at thank you at Miami-Dade College. And so I actually like started this just like literally started one day where at my college we have like a change making hub. And
Mhm.
so part of there's like several institutes within there, and one of them is focused on civic engagement and democracy. And it was like a rabbit hole. Like first it started with like kind of looking at the different things, and now I'm basically helping recruit poll workers, and also we're doing voter
Awesome.
engagement. And it's been a great experience. So we just finished recruiting for the primary election in August, and now we're going, starting up for the election day. So it's been great. So thank you. Some of the things that I have like really been, has kind of been like enlightening for me has been getting to see so many of the different perspectives, at least in Miami. We have like a lot of different people coming from all different types of backgrounds. As we have a lot of like first generation Americans as well. And so that's challenging for a lot of students to navigate, especially if they don't really have someone to like at home show them like, hey, make sure you get register here or do this. We really have to like go on like the baby steps. And I think like
Definitely.
it can feel very like scary if you see all of like your peers going so far ahead of you and you feel like, wait, what's happening? So definitely like scaling things back and trying to build connections has just been such a great experience. In terms of policy, I mean, at least in uh, Miami, we have a lot recently, especially now that we're in hurricane season. It's been a lot of climate issues. So I'm definitely like on my end, I'm a public administration major. That's my plan. And so I do want to work in like legislative, probably like local legislation. And so definitely looking at all the different, I mean, there's just so many ways to address it. And so looking for ways to kind of like jump on that from these like different like youth initiatives, kind of like uh, youth empower project. Like I was just like looking at y'all's website, and it's just so great. I really love seeing that. And so we have a couple here as well, so it's been great, great experience so far. And yeah, I'm really happy to be here.
Awesome. No, thank you so much for being here and also for sharing your story and experiences. I think like it is so powerful what you're talking about really looking in your community and seeing what those needs are. And how like you're right, like oftentimes when we see government not working or the education system not working, like it can be incredibly intimidating. It can be scary, especially if you're first gen, if you don't have someone to turn to be like, this is the path, like this is what you should be doing. And I think it's also like so important, like something like climate change policy is something that is very new and continuing to change constantly as our world's changing. So being able to look into your community and see like, what do people in Miami need right now? And as we were, on the last slide talking about like, what can Miami City Council do? What can the state legislature do? What can be done nationally to address the issue more broadly? So that's really like I love to hear, you already thinking about that because it's such an important part of this, like what's next, right? Like, we can elect people into office, and that's great. But we also, as young people, like have the ability to hold our elected officials accountable. And one of the best ways to do that is, trying to actually work with them to change policy.
Yeah.
Um, may have time for like one or two other people to share. If anyone else wants to come off mute or just drop in the chat.
I can read Chloe's. We just got one from
Oh
Chloe.
my gosh.
But Chloe is from Loudlight, and which is a nonpartisan nonprofit in Kansas. And she got started in this work through Bonner Scholars Program from the Bonner Foundation, which is a great foundation. They do a lot of amazing work. As a voter reg fellow for her first semester in college in 2020, and then stayed on staff and eventually took over the teaching of our youth organizing fellowships ever since.
Congrats.
That is amazing. There are obviously lots of negative stereotypes about Kansas being backwards, red state, rural, middle of nowhere, and all the Dorothy jokes that come with that. Oh gosh. But a lot of people don't understand that the really radical history of Kansas being literally bleeding Kansas, the free state, all the way through being the first state to hold a post-Dobbs abortion amendment. That is absolutely true. And our communities are often forgotten and treated as less valuable because they are flyover states. But this work is important to helping folks know that they can carve out a life here and they don't have to move to make it. We aren't regressive, just politically oppressed at the moment. And I just kind of want to affirm you in that space as someone who goes to a school in the Deep South and is closing out my collegiate career in Louisiana. We often get a lot of the brunt of those opinions and stereotypes about what we're capable of. But clearly, you being here and me being here is a testament that good work comes out of any state. And stereotypes of the South, stereotypes of Southern states do not reflect the work and the historical precedent that takes place in the civic engagement space, and those that choose to do the work even now. And so very on brand with today's presentation and today's summit. And so we're glad you're here. Congrats on all the amazing work, and we hope to stay in touch with you and see what you do in the future.
Oh, wow. So inspiring. Dang. And I think like what like Lailah, I know you just touched on, you also, when sharing out touched on is like really like this work is not a, kind of existing in a silo, right? Like no amount of, doing the stuff on a college campus, or doing stuff, in your typical like more urban environments, like none of that is going to change the world without truly like uniting with our peers, especially as young people across the country. And I think it's really beautiful being in spaces like this today, where we are coming together with change makers from across the country, to really see how we can build that better future together. So yeah, very very grateful that you all are here. And with that, we're gonna continue in the conversation, by talking. So like once you have a solution in mind, and oftentimes like even like internally, like with Youth Power Project, when we're coming up with a policy idea, it's not always like we are like, oh, this is exactly what's going to work, but at the very least, like you have an idea, you're like, let's give this a shot, like let's start talking to people, and really that's when we start turning to the legislative process. So I'm not going to go full deep dive into the entire process because it is a lot. It's still confusing to me, and I've been working on this for a while. But I think like one of the important things to know, like as a young person entering the policy space, whether it's state legislature, which because we're from across the country, like every state's so different, can't really walk you all through that. But one of the important things to know is that like these spaces, our legislatures, are the people's house, right? Like they are only there because they're elected by their constituents. So really like I remember the first time I entered Congress, I was like, I'm allowed to walk in here. Like I just walked through a metal detector and they're like, go in. And I was like, there's no like visitor log, like you don't have to pick my ID, like there's nothing. Like, these spaces are very much, meant to be open to the public because they are there to represent. So I think that's the first thing, that like, really own your power as a young person, as a constituent, that like, these spaces are for you, and you should 100% like you know, as scary as it can be sometimes to enter them, like know that like you have every right to be there as much as someone who has been working there or is a member of Congress or legislature. Um, and then the second thing I really like would say is that at no point in the process of like being a young person starting to work in policy will you ever be doing it alone. And I really think that's where, you know, kind of which we'll talk about later, like coalition building, but also just like if you have an idea and you get to connect with someone, either, you know, on the Hill or at your state legislature or in your city council, like the job of these people is to help get policy, like good policy passed. So if you have a good idea that like they think they can work on, like you will 100% have an ally in that office who will be able to help you through this mess of a process. Because obviously, as we know about like, especially our federal politics, but often our state politics as well, like it is so incredibly partisan and divisive and, you know, difficult to get things passed. So don't like stress about feeling like you need to know, you know, every step of this process and know which committee your bill would go to and, you know, who is, you know, the best person to XYZ. Because in reality, so much of this process will be stuff that you'll be able to learn alongside you know, the office that you'd be working with if you are able to get a policy proposal accepted. So definitely like don't feel like you have to be a poli sci major to write a bill. Like you can really, like anyone can do it. And it's just like such an open process that so few people actually engage with. So one example, and this is one that actually we've had some recent movement on, was the Youth Power Project created a resolution declaring a youth mental health crisis in the United States. And it was introduced in the House in the fall last year. And it was written entirely by young people and was brought to the office in the fall and introduced in May. And was a bipartisan resolution. So that meant that, you know, it was, you know, Republican members, Democrat members, and, you know, really showed that like, you know, something that a young person on our team like worked on was like if you look it up on congress.gov, like that resolution is there. And just recently, actually last week, there was a Senate version of this resolution that was written entirely by young people that was introduced and passed unanimously in the Senate. So this is a, you know, 100% bipartisan resolution that, you know, is different than a law in the sense that, you know, there is no like funding attached to it or, you know, kind of program attached to it. But what these resolutions do is they, you know, really put a flag in the ground that like this is an issue that, you know, we care about. So it sets a really great precedent going forward that like Congress has declared that there's a youth mental health crisis. And like that really gives, you know, us and organizers across the country the leverage to say that like, you know, we're going to use this and really run with it. So that's just like one example of like an idea that one of our teammates had like 2 years ago that she just started working on and then was able to get to the point that it actually has passed the US Senate, which, you know, that doesn't happen every day. So it definitely is something that is everyone can do. And like genuinely, when it comes to writing a bill, like this is something that like you can just open a Google Doc. Like every bill I've ever written has started with a Google Doc and then some internet research. Because like there's just so much information out there that you can use to inform, you know, what kind of type of policy you might be interested in, especially like you like really like plagiarism is bad obviously, but like when it comes to writing a bill, like your job is to build off of existing precedent. So definitely like looking at, you know, existing law, whether it's local, state, federal, and seeing how you can, you know, stretch and expand upon existing law to really make whatever, you know, impact based on, you know, what you see as a need in your community. And then also like don't be afraid that like you can make a mistake and it's gonna, I don't know, like screw over some person. Like it's not gonna happen. Because once like a policy is written, once like you are working with an office, like they will make sure like it's run by lawyers and like no one's gonna get sued over something you write. So make sure you really like, own your voice and like what your goals are and like don't lose them in the process. Because it's really important to be able to like have that ownership over those issues that you're advocating for in your policy. I won't go super deep into the pitching process just because there's a lot of information on this slide. But essentially like kind of the idea of once you kind of have this policy, right, we talked before, like how do you develop that goal and how do you like look and work within your community to really see what is that need. Then like it really works best when you go into a meeting with the legislature with by the way, like you can email them and set up a meeting, like that they're going to set up meetings with you. Again, as I said before, like they are there for you. So it's really important to like own that part of it again of like actually knowing that you have access to them. And once you like figure out like who you want to reach out to and research and connect with them, that like these people get lobbied to by corporate lobbyists all the time, right? So they are hearing from big tech and from big pharma and everyone, like, so you do not have to go in there being like, I have the best research in the world, I have the best XYZ. Like the most important thing that you have when you're going to lobby for a bill like is your story. And I think like that's something that's so incredibly important. And like sharing that story is like a really great way to make an impact. And I want to pass over to Lailah to share from her perspective as well, what the pitching process is like, and tips for that.
Yeah, just to kind of emphasize what has already been said, pitching legislation is not only an empowering facet of the advocacy journey, but it is something that you can tangibly show as like a product of your work. And so it's something that you should be proud of. We've all written papers, we've all done research reports, we've all done things that is on a syllabus before, but this is something that you are writing, you are drafting it, and you are creating it with your story in mind, your story centric and the story of others. And so there should be a pride that you take in that. And so while it is important to rehearse and to make sure that you have a comprehensive understanding of what you're talking about before you get in front of a legislator, you also need to take stock of where you're coming from and make sure that everything that you're saying is authentic to you. Statements, if you have anecdotes and testimonies from those in your community, share those, invite them to come with you so that everybody can give their testimony as comprehensively as they possibly can. But this is your thing, and and if you're working with an organization, I definitely want to emphasize that, like it was mentioned earlier, you will never go into the policy process alone. And this is just part of that gap bridging process where you can get connected with people that might have the institutional power to get you all the way, but a lot of the work you've already done on your own. And then, anticipating any questions about, what implications will this have? They'll ask you about college campuses. They'll ask you about reception that you've already gotten so far. This is kind of anecdotally on a smaller scale, but whenever me and my peers produce any bills through our student government on campus, and we bring it to administrators, the first thing they ask us is who's supporting this on campus? What groups and what demographics are backing this before, you kind of give us this pitch so that you can, show that there's buy-in and show that there is, contribution to what you're saying, but also so that you can have that solidarity behind you, be like, me and my peers all agree that this is an important way forward. We just need your help on the institutional level. And that is a great way to get your point across in a way that is very mature and very professional and can sometimes really make the difference. And then just keep in touch follow up, gather any materials that you think are relevant to your cause. I think it shows a lot of professionalism and a lot of care and passion on your end if you are continuing to, like push the envelope when it comes to, I think, the perceived understanding of student advocacy. You see people, kind of paint this broad stroke over youth activists as they say they want something and then the work dies out. But that is not at all the precedent, or I guess the chip on your shoulder that you have to bring into these kinds of situations. If you have the content, you've done the research and you've done the material, share it, because I guarantee you it might actually change the perspective or open a new perspective for the legislator that you're talking to or the office that you're working with that they might not have considered before due to either generational gaps or gaps in understanding about what the work they're doing and the work that you have done. And so pitching legislation, it seems very daunting, but in the long run, it can have such a positive effect not only on you and your presenting skills and your research skills, but it can also have a large impact on your community if we have any successful legislation that goes through.
Awesome. So just for time's sake, I'm going to skip through a couple things. So if you see stuff on your screen, don't stress. But more than happy to share more on this later. I want to pass it over to Lailah to talk a bit more about building a coalition.
Yeah, coalition building is something that we've touched on very briefly throughout this presentation, but I think it is something extremely important when understanding the policy and civic engagement process. The saying, Rome wasn't built in a day, but we also, want to emphasize that it wasn't built by one person. And it is extremely important to put together community partners and allies in order to make a strong coalition in support of your bill or your legislation or an act that you want to pass or any sort of community advocacy work. Like I was mentioning earlier, numbers and having that buy-in, whether that's views, whether that's intergenerational buy-in, can definitely provide a lot of strength in having a diverse group of people that are kind of backing you on the legislation that you want to put forth. But it is not just the putting a group together and saying, oh, this is our group and we have a lot of ideas. You have to work within that group to find the shared common goals, narrow those down, and create them into tangible policy. Sometimes I think in youth spaces, we can get caught up in wanting to make sure that we're covering every single thing at once, and it can cause us to feel a little bit stressed when we want to get work done. But if you work with the coalition or the group or individuals that are supporting you to find a cause that you can hone in and combine everybody's shared skills and backgrounds to really work on, you can get a lot done in a shorter amount of time. Particularly in the health space, we see a lot of institutional complexity when it comes to stakeholders and their understandings of outcomes for certain policies. But when you build these partnerships, you allow for all of the perspectives and interests to be reflected in your messaging, and you can anticipate any sort of opposition that you might receive, because while we want to make this seem like a more comprehensive process, there will always be opposition, there will always be pushback, and you will face that throughout your entire youth advocacy and hopefully just advocacy career. But it should not deter you or the group that you're working with to continue pushing forward and maybe pivot to find ways to readjust your pitch. And that can be through research targets, coffee chats, meetings, workshops, all the things that we mentioned before.
Iconic. Coalitions are so important. Again, going to be skipping through some stuff, so I'm going to touch on everything like very briefly for time's sake, but always more than happy to talk more about any of these things later. One thing is always like having intergenerational dialogue and connection in lobbying, especially as a youth organizer and advocate, is so important. And also just like really paying attention to the media landscape and conversations in the legislature about your topic, whether it's climate change, it's mental health, it's civic engagement. There's just so many different ways to really like tap in and really meet the moment, which is incredibly important. It could be with hearings. There's lots of ways to testify at state and local meetings, but also federally, there's opportunities as well to get your voice heard. There's letters of support, which is a great way even if you're early in the process of like being able to find people who are willing to say like our organization believes in this so much, like we're going to send a letter on behalf of it. Making phone calls to legislators, incredibly important. Social media, I'm sure you all know, incredibly important, to be able to connect with young folks, and really bring them into the conversations around policy or organizing is just so impactful. And then press, like it is incredibly important, especially if you're working on a bill in the state legislature or federally, to get people to hear about what you're doing. We've had some cool opportunities like Teen Vogue article, Politico, etc., that were really earned based on continuing to build our coalitions, strengthening our messaging, and really pushing these policy ideas that are important to us into these broader conversations, so they know that like young people are trusted in these conversations. And with that, I'm gonna pass it over to Lailah to talk about how to be an ethical student advocate.
Yeah, so thank you. And we've talked about how to get involved in the new space, how to get involved with the legislative process. And so you're fired up and you're ready to go. But something important to keep in mind is how to be an ethical student advocate. And that is something extremely important that we'll delve into. So firstly, understanding intersectionality, especially at a summit like this, is vital and important when you begin any part of the advocacy process or the legislative process. So just to kind of give you a little bit of background, if you're not familiar with intersectionality, it was first coined in 1989 by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, and she defined intersectionality as one of the main ways in which we as students can effectively and ethically amplify all voices and experiences. And so when we talk about coalition building, when we're building these coalitions, we can't just have perspectives that affirm our own. Obviously having shared values and shared interests is important, but varied voices and experiences play a large role in whether or not you're able to find a holistic and comprehensive approaches to some of the main issues affecting students. Intersectionality can also take the form of sparking discourse. And when I say discourse, I don't mean chaos, I mean discourse, having conversations in a constructive manner that can challenge one another to think deeper about the intricacies of certain issues. And then mobilizing communities. Intersectionality can help us join communities together by recognizing all of our differences and our shared experiences in order to accomplish a lot in certain spaces. And so if you would like to share, in the chat very briefly, how you include intersectionality in your work, and maybe at the end, we'll have some time to like go through maybe some of the responses. But if you just want to take a little look at this, and of course, you feel free to get connected with us. We'd love to hear more about how intersectionality is involved in your work. And if you're seeing it lacking in your spaces, we'd love to help you find ways to improve that. So social media. We talked about social media as an important form of getting connected with not only local officials, people within your community, people outside your community, but we also have to take stock and remind ourselves that social media is not always the most authentic space. And it doesn't mean it's bad, it just means we have to be extra diligent as advocates to understand what is legitimate, what is illegitimate, and how to best utilize these resources that we have for the common good. And so social media has recently been used to campaign for social and environmental issues that are important to students. These campaigns obviously can be extremely impactful in mobilizing and outreach, tons of views, tons of likes, all that amazing stuff. But despite all of the success stories, especially the ones that we've seen, social media campaigns can sometimes remove the humanity of certain topics. And it's important to be cognizant of the sensitivity of certain events, especially if it's surrounding mental health, if it's surrounding voting rights, equal rights advocacy. We don't want to utilize stories and real struggles faced by ourselves or people within our community as talking points if we're not going to specifically integrate those talking points or integrate those experiences into the work that we're doing in a way that is authentic, not only to ourselves, but those who are sharing their stories or choosing to share their stories. And so how can student activism influence policy decisions now that we've combined all of that together, our final kind of considerations? So we've got advocacy and lobbying, we have culture change, we can advocate and have dialogues about what we care about, and you yourself can help shift certain culture on topics that might have seemed at a stalemate, might have seemed stagnant for a while. You can be the change. And that sounds corny, but you absolutely can be. And lastly, you can harness your power. Working on your advocacy skills can help you build a certain self-confidence, public speaking skills, and assertiveness. I cannot emphasize enough that my public speaking skills and my ability to connect with others has been increased tenfold by my own internal reflection on how I can be a better advocate for people and for myself, for that matter. And people in power take notice when outspoken students stand up for what they believe in, whether or not they agree with you on the initial perception. Sometimes that's a little bit varied, but they notice and they take stock of what you're saying, and it can actually help them change some of their perspectives as well.
Definitely. And Lailah, I think like that last point you just gave about like, people take notice when young people are, and like voices as young advocates, whether that's through voter registration and education or through policy and organizing. Like there is such a power of being a young person that is like speaking up on issues of importance, regardless of what they are. That I think it's just such an incredibly important like thing to like recognize that like your voice has like power, like it genuinely does, and like don't let anyone tell you otherwise, because like you can really make whatever impact that you want to make.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and just briefly, I know we're like only have a couple of minutes left, so we'll just kind of like finish up on this last note of sustaining your advocacy, because obviously we've been talking a lot at this summit about kind of the legacy of Freedom Summer, and obviously we're here, the Andrew Goodman Foundation, and kind of Andrew Goodman's story, and just like advocacy is not always safe. It is not always something that can be done easily for a lot of people. So I just kind of want to end on a note about really how to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves when we are doing this important work as young people. So a couple of like the key things like to hit on, like first, like managing tokenization. Like definitely, like as a young person, it's really easy for people to only value your opinion because you're young and like representing all young people. So make sure like when you're in these spaces, especially policy spaces that tend to be a lot older, with a lot of people that have been in there for a while, like to remind yourself that like your value is not just because you're young, it's also because your lived experiences make you an expert on your issue area. I think the second really important thing is setting boundaries. Definitely, like no one should have to be volunteering endless and endless time without getting paid. Like that is such an issue in the advocacy space. So really like knowing like what your limits are and what you're comfortable with is so important, especially as we're approaching a really, really intense election season. Knowing that like there's always a time and a place where you'll need to step away to mitigate harm to yourself, especially when we're talking about situations and issues that might be incredibly personal to you and other advocates in this space. But like there is no shame in having to take a moment and be like, I can't be the best advocate right now. Your like self-care and comfort should always come first. Movements are not won by individuals, they're won by people coming together. So if you're not doing well, like the work is not going to do well, and you're not going to be an effective part of the movement. And last thing, like again, like the idea that as we mentioned before, like Rome was not built in one day, and it was not built by one person. And it's kind of cheesy, but it's true. Like, really all of this work can only be done in community by working together. So really trying to bring in, your friends, your family, your peers all over into the work. So I know we're out of time. So thank you all so much for coming. On behalf of myself and Lailah and just Youth Power Project, overall, we want to thank you guys for being here. And if you have any questions, feel free to send us an email, follow on social media, wherever. And yeah, just grateful for being here.
Thank y'all so much. It was so great to engage with you all, and we hope to hear from y'all soon.